needs to be, is it controlled from there or from here?
Wait, I think.
Okay, while we're waiting, I'll try to entertain you. In fact, I'll ask you some questions. So, most people here are students, but they're students of what? Economics? Who's studying economics here? Okay. Psychology? One, maybe. Sociology? Okay. And the others who don't fall in these categories, what do they study?
Political science.
Okay. Political science. Anthropology?
Cultural anthropology.
Cultural anthropology. Okay. Good. So it's up. So I'm very glad actually to be here. I was very, very, very happy when I received the email from Ulrich Brandt. I didn't know such a thing existed. I didn't know about this ring for Lesungen. And then Fellini explained a little bit to me how it works. And I think it's a very, very nice entrepreneurial initiative to exactly get different disciplines to talk to each other. And this is exactly the kind of research that I do, and most of us in our institute in Berlin do, exactly try to attack these problems that can only be attacked, and you can only make progress if you bring in ideas from different disciplines. So this lecture will be exactly an exercise on this kind of thing, specifically applied to boundary rationality. So, who here has heard the term boundary rationality already before this lecture? Okay, I think it would be more people. So, so don't worry. Exactly the point of the lecture is that even though it's something that's discussed a lot in the social sciences, like the ones that you all studying, but also in engineering, in management science, operations research. Even though it's really a popular buzzword for many academics and many practitioners, in fact, there is very little agreement on what it is. And I think what's worse is that there's not even an acknowledgement that there is disagreement. But sometimes people do the following. They either they study their own version of boundary rationality, and ignore everybody else who's doing it in another way, or they don't even know that some other people are doing it in another way. I think both of these things are bad. Let me start by telling you a little bit about the man who in fact is credited as being the father of this concept. So his name is Herbert Simon. He was really one of these 20th century polymaths. He's dead now since 10 years. He was very active after the Second War and until the end of the previous century. Extremely active, very prolific. So he managed to win the Nobel Prize in economics, but he himself saw himself more as a psychologist. So he was more interested in understanding how people make decisions, reason, think, and so on. Nevertheless, after he died, his long-term colleague James March, who some of you who study business may have heard of, he's a very, very famous management and business scholar who's still around, wrote something in his honor, in his memory, and he basically called him Herbert Simon, behavioral economist. So there's a sense in which behavioral economics goes back to a very large extent to the work of Herbert Simon. He also founded the field of artificial intelligence, more or less, and he was also active in many, his background was in fact in political science, so he was one of these people that was being everywhere. But it wasn't exactly that he had a hobby to do as many different papers, as many different books, and to be involved in as many different disciplines as possible. Everything is really coming back together to a very large extent to what it means to be rational, the different ways in which humans, computers, and other organisms are rational, and to try to understand, make theoretical progress in all these questions, And eventually he was also very interested in applied progress. So as I said, he's really widely credited with creating the first artificial intelligences. So for our purposes today, I would like to focus on boundary rationality. So I'm not exactly going to attempt to give a definition of what he said, because he said many different things about boundary rationality in many different ways. The thing that he's mostly known of is to talking about boundary rationality in contrast to neoclassical rationality. So neoclassical rationality in economics means that somehow to be rational means to know everything and to act in the best possible way. So let's say, for example, you need to make a decision, for example, in which apartment to rent. There's a few choices. You would somehow know all the possible choices. You would know everything that there is to know about these apartments. So for example, you wouldn't only know the rent, but you would also know who has lived there before, in what state the hydraulics is, in what state the floor is. You would really have to know everything, absolutely everything. That's the idea of neoclassical economic rationality. And if you did know everything, then you would set up an optimization model, which you indeed optimize, so that in the end you pick the choice that maximizes your utility. It's a very crazy idea, but that was really, to a large extent, the idea that neoclassical economists have. Of course now, I'm creating a caricature of it, but in the end, that's what it was. It came back, in a way, some people saw it coming back to Adam Smith's original notion of the invisible head. So Adam Smith said, how can it be that the market works so well? It doesn't work so well because everybody, the butcher, everybody who's selling us something, the people who go to the butcher to buy the meat and so on, know everything, but somehow in the end, the market works as if we all knew everything. The market works perfectly. And this idea of neoclassical rationality was supposed to be an expression of the fact that markets work well. If you press any economist or any other person, they will tell you, of course, it's not true that we can know everything, and we don't know everything, but in the end, we act as if we know everything. And of course, sometimes it's forgotten that as if part, and what's left is this idea of rationality, which means you know everything, you do all the computations perfectly, and then in the end, you pick the best choice for you. Choice, the best meaning, the one that maximizes your utility. And even though right now you may think it would be ridiculous for this idea to be taken literally, there was a time in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s where it was. And Herbert Simon simply said that it cannot possibly be true. You cannot possibly say that people, human beings with all their limitations, are able to know everything and to compute everything optimally. And this is the interpretation of bounded rationality as opposed to unbounded rationality that's mostly, for which Simon is mostly well known. But he said many, many other things. So for example, the first time you hear about it, the first time you hear bounded rationality, you may think that it's a negative thing. The first part of the term bounded, sounds a little bit like it, right? Bounded. It's just not a good thing. There's some bounds. We're not extending infinitely. But he didn't exactly mean it that way. In fact, many times he said that he thought that people's bounded rationality is superior to the optimization models that a theorist or an academic could write down. But this part was kind of forgotten. Parenthetically, you could also expect, if you knew a little bit about his work, why he would say that bounded rationality sometimes is a good thing. It's exactly because when you try to build a computer that behaves as a person, then you realize that that still holds today. There are many things that people can do which computers cannot do. One famous example like this is pattern recognition. If you still try to go to a secure site where they're trying to figure out if you're a real person or an automated algorithm that's simply trying to find out credit card information of people, you see this small squiggle. It's a pattern, a strange pattern, right? 2, T, F, X, there's some symbols there. And these are written, the contours are a little bit weird, so that only a person could, in the end, replicate and say very quickly that this is 2, T, F, and so on. A computer cannot reliably do this. So this is one of the examples in which you can see that our bounds and our biases in fact make us superior to computers. And that was central to Simon's interpretation about what it means to be rational. So bounded rational meant another kind of rationality that's not necessarily worse than rationality you would get from a model, from an optimization model. But this was kind of forgotten. This was kind of forgotten. And a lot of other things he said about bounded rationality was forgotten. And I'm going to argue that the situation has come to resemble something like what this man said. So this is another man, he's from England. He was very, very famous in the, I would say, in the first half of the 20th century. So he was first a scientist, I think he was a chemist or a physicist. Then he became a high-level civil servant in the UK. And then eventually he became a writer, a writer of fiction, but also of other essays. And he became quite famous when in '59 he delivered this lecture in Cambridge that was called The Two Cultures, I think. That's the whole, excuse me, that's the whole name of the lecture, from which I borrowed. And the point was, according to C.P. Snow, at that time there were two cultures of thinking in the world. And the one was the culture of scientists, the other one was the culture of humanities people. And his argument was basically that these are two very different ways of looking at the world. And these two cultures don't really talk to each other, and that's basically very bad, and it's a major barrier for building a better society and building understanding and getting the smart people that could be working in science or in humanities to work together towards improving society. And as I said, I started noticing at some point that the situation in bounded rationality resembled this situation that Snow described. Of course, to a much smaller scale, because bounded rationality is very much smaller than trying to improve society, but still, I started developing this idea that there were two cultures also in research on bounded rationality. And this is exactly what I will try to talk to you about in the next 45 minutes, 1 hour. So I call them cultures, and I'm not that sophisticated in what that could mean as those of you here who study sociology, anthropology, or something like this, but at least I will try to be clear about it. So here's a definition of what we mean by culture for the next hour. So it has to do with bounded rationality and research on bounded rationality. And it has two kinds of things, technical things and storytelling things. So, because bounded rationality is a scientific topic, or at least that's the part of bounded rationality I will talk about, there's data, yes? And there is models that summarize this data and allow us to go beyond this data looking for new data. So this is the one aspect of a culture. And the other aspect is a story. So data and models are technical things, and not everybody can follow them, or not everybody is interested in following them. It's mostly for scientists. But eventually, especially in an area such as economics or the other social sciences you're studying, eventually there's going to be a platform where we all talk to each other. Scientists, academics, practitioners, politicians, policymakers. All these people can talk to each other in the end only in terms of a story. Of course, some politicians are economists. They have a scientific background and they could also perhaps follow the data and the models. But by and large, the place where we all meet and do policy is a story. So the culture is the technical part plus the story. And economics, of course, is a very big field. There is a lot of different ideas and parts of it. But most of it doesn't care about stories. There is a part of it that does. For example, Deirdre McCloskey has a wonderful book that's called The Rhetoric of Economics. And this was already written in the 80s. And there's more work like this that talks about stories in economics, not so much about the hard facts, the data and the models, but about stories. But nevertheless, usually it's ignored. So the first point of what I'm trying to build up in this lecture is that the culture is not only the technical part, but also is the storytelling part. And what I'm going to say is exactly, you're going to see it written here, but I've in fact already said it, but here it's written a little more precisely. So I'm going to say there's two cultures of research in bound rationality, and that in the end is important because they lead to two very different approaches to theory, practice, and policy. Of course, now before we get into it, you may be wondering, okay, why are there exactly two? And in fact, when I was discussing with other colleagues the paper that I wrote, of course, many people started saying, no, there are three, or there are more than that. And certainly, there is a point up to which you can seriously claim that it's exactly two, but that's not really my point. My point is to make it clear that it's not a uniform field. Bound rationality does not speak with one voice, so there's some dissent, and to realize that this can be very important practically. And in the end, it's a way for starting the conversation. So the two is not that important in a way. And after you see which two I mean, based on some other information you may have from your classes or from research papers you read, we can also discuss if there should be something else here. The important thing is that there's different ways of viewing bound rationality, and this is important. That's what I'm going to argue. And in the process of arguing that, actually, I'm going to take you through a lot of important developments in what's called behavioral economics. So, the first culture is one that we'll call idealistic. So, it's one that is in fact not very different from unbounded rationality. Remember, before I tried to explain a little bit how unbounded rationality looks. So it's basically the idea of an omniscient person that optimizes a utility function, knows everything and optimizes. As you will see in the right next slide, if you don't already know, the typical game that bound rationality plays in behavioral economics is maintaining this machinery of a utility function, but adding other things to it. These things, for example, sometimes are called social preferences, social norms, and so on. You will see very soon if you don't know already. But the point is, I call this idealistic because it's very close to the ideal. The inspiration is that there's this ideal person. And I don't mean ideal here, obviously, in the sense that this person is morally good or there's no any other political connotation. It's ideal only in the sense that it cannot be a human, it cannot be a mortal being. It's an idealization. And the opposite of ideal is something that's called pragmatic in the English dictionary. And it's completely different. Instead of starting from something that couldn't be, a person couldn't be this thing, you start exactly by how the person is. So you look at how people sometimes make their decisions, and then you find out that of course they ignore information, and of course they do not optimize, and they just use some simple rules of thumb, as we say. So if you get back to that example about the apartment, of course you don't know everything about the apartments, and you really don't care. In fact, you're trying to learn as little as you know to make your decision. If you already found a good apartment, of course you realize that there could be 10 or 20 more apartments in Hamburg that would be better for you, but you don't care. If this apartment is already good, you're going to go for it. That's how it works. You try to ignore information to go for a satisfactory outcome. So in the English tradition, this is often called that you're being pragmatic. So it's the opposite in a way from being idealistic. And in the end, the point is exactly that these are the two cultures of bound rationality. And now let me try to explain it with examples. First, we're going to go to the technical aspects. And here I'm going to make another digression, which to some people could be a bit of a surprise if you don't know the kind of evidence that behavioral economics is based on. Some of it is very real, some of it is very practical, but most of it, and in fact, to a large extent, the beginnings of it, the beginning of evidence on which behavioral economics was built, was actually from things like this. So what is that? It's a choice and the risk that you have to make if you're a participant in behavioral economics experiments. It started from psychology, of course, but it really was endorsed by behavioral economics. So what does it mean? Each one of these things is called a gamble. It can also be called a lottery or a prospect. Let's call it a gamble. And it's exactly what it is. So the first thing, the thing that says 10,1/2 colon 0,1/2 means I will offer you a deal. I will say, okay, I have a coin, and I'm going to flip the coin. And if the coin lands heads, I'm going to give you 10 euros. But if it lands on the other side, tails, I'm not going to give you anything. So that's a gamble. There's an element of probability of risk here. You don't know what's going to happen. You may get 10, you may get nothing. It all depends on how the coin lands, their probabilities and their outcomes. The second case is a special case of that, where you don't have any probabilities. You know for sure, so with probability 1, that you're going to get 4 euros. So, decision psychologists and economists, they're very interested in these kinds of choices, because these choices are the domain of expected utility theory as it was modeled and studied by von Neumann and Morgenstern, which are in many ways very, very important for economics. Only Morgenstern was an economist. Von Neumann was again one of these other characters like Herbert Simon, but more towards the mathematics, natural science kind of area, not social science like Simon. Von Neumann did everything. Anyway, in 1944, they presented a mathematical theory that tells you exactly how to make these kinds of choices, assuming that you believe some simple axioms. So the axioms, for example, could be transitivity. If you like gamble A more than gamble B, and gamble B more than gamble C, then you should like gamble A more than gamble C. This is an example of transitivity. It's reasonable. And the other axioms also seem reasonable to a first glance, even though sometimes they're more complicated. So if you believe the axioms, then they prove mathematically that you should basically pick the gamble that maximizes your expected utility. And later there will be an explication of that. Anyway, because this was basically, for the economists, was an explication of what it means to be rational for these kinds of choices, and they knew exactly the theory. And as you can see, it's not so difficult to run these experiments. You can bring actually hundreds of people in the lab, give them these tasks, and then see if they're really acting according to expected utility theory. And this is exactly what people did. What is a little bit problematic is that even though that's a good model about many choices in the world, it's of course a very limited model. If you think about it yourself, of course you make choices, and in the choices there are outcomes and the probabilities. But when in your life did a choice present itself to you like this? When did ever an apartment appear to you so that you could really say, yes, with probability, let's say 20%, I will get this reward, with probability 30%, I will get this, and so on. Often we know the different outcomes, even though that's also a difficult story how to quantify them. But it's very, very difficult to know the probabilities. So it almost never looks like that. And that, of course, has been criticized by many other behavioral scientists. This is a huge abstraction. So that's a way in which this is very disappointing when you realize that a lot about what we supposedly know about people's decision-making comes from how they do this. And in a way it was even worse, because it mostly happened in the lab with undergraduate students. So many of the early researchers would just take you. And during the class, they would administer these kinds of questions, and they would get it back, and that was their data. But you're not representative of the whole population. There's so many people that don't go to university. There's so many people that are much older than you, or younger than you. And all of those that were not in the data. Of course, eventually, they were. But not always, and not in the beginning. Another problem is that initially, because there was not so much money for funding research, this was all hypothetical. So I had to tell you, imagine that after I flipped this coin, and there was no coin actually, they were just telling you, imagine that with 50% chance you'll get 10 euros and 50% chance you'll get 0. But it was hypothetical. In a way, why would you care? I mean, you wouldn't make any money anyway. Why would you reveal your true preferences? So all these problems did exist. As I said, they're alleviated to some extent in later research. But in the end, that's how it started. Anyway, given this parenthesis, okay, by the way, this is the unbounded rationality solution, which is the expected utility solution. I don't know how much you feel comfortable with math. I don't know if you've seen it before. The idea is that there is a utility function, this u. So u of 10 would mean 10 euros, how much is it worth for you? It's kind of normalized, right? It's between 0 and 1. So it could be 0.25 or 0.75. Depends how rich or how poor you are. Then there's the probabilities. And in the end, if you think about it, I don't know how good you are in probability and statistics, but what it says on the left-hand side, this is the expected utility of choosing this risky thing, and this is the utility of choosing the other thing. So you can see, you choose the one that maximizes your utility. Maybe you can see it quickly, if not, it's not that important. What I wanted you to see is how the unbounded rationality solution looks like. The probabilities, their utilities, and how you put them together and you maximize the expectation. And this is, in some sense, the beginning of a lot of behavioral economics. So you may have heard of Daniel Kahneman. Recently he became even more famous than he was because he published this book that's called Thinking Fast and Slow. In almost every major airport, you can find it. You can certainly find it in the Berlin airport. It's really a popular explication of this kind of ideas, of the ideas that went on to lead to behavioral economics. It was published in a journal in economics that's called Econometrica, which is really steeped in prestige and rigor. So it was a very big success, because neither he nor Amos Tversky, his colleague, were economists, they were psychologists. But they managed to break through into a discipline that's very paradigmatic, and it's not easy for other social scientists to break through. So what did they say? They created a model of bound rationality, which I put up there schematically. So my point now is to try to convince you that this model is idealistic and that it looks a lot like an unbounded rationality model. So you have two functions. The one on top is the utility function. So basically what it would say, what it's supposed to say is that, let's say, the 10 euros is here and it's worth something to you. If you are going to lose minus 10 euros, then it will be worth something else. So they speculated and they proposed a specific form for the utility function based on empirical evidence, of course. And then there's another function which you didn't see before, which is called the probability weighting function. So here on the x-axis you see the probability, and here you see somehow what it means to you. So what's the idea here? The idea is that if you play the lottery, what's the chance that you win a lottery, that you win a big amount? It's really astronomically small. It's 1 in a billion or something like this. Nevertheless, so this is the real value of the probability. Nevertheless, you keep on playing. And if somebody asks you, but what's the chance you win? Of course, you know that it's small, but you don't think it's really as small as it really is. So if you look at this function, you go up here, and you think it's a little bit larger than it really is. So you're above the diagonal. So they postulated these things, they put them together, and then in the end they have a model that looks very much like the original model, but it has, let's say, psychologically informed utility and probability weighting functions. That's the game they played. But I'm going to argue that this is an idealistic model because it still lives in the shadow of the expected utility model. In which sense? In the sense that it doesn't throw away the basic concepts. There are utilities, there are probabilities, you put them together and you still maximize. To put it in a different way, they still retain the model, but they created a more dumb version of it, a dumber version of it. So normally, you shouldn't be overweighting. Where does that come from? It's a bias. So you should be on the diagonal, and you do. So it's a little bit as if they were saying people try to be the ideal, but they simply can't. They're a worse version of the ideal. That's one way of reading this kind of work. So once again, it's being inspired by ideal. That's why we call it idealistic. There's still the notion of optimizing. You put them together and you pick the one that optimizes your utility. It's just that your utility is a little bit wrong. It's not how it should be. And finally, getting back to this point about the as-if interpretations that I said before, if you confronted somebody, do you really think that's how people do it? So they think about how their utility function is, and they come up with this state. They think about the probability weighting function, and they come up with this state. And then they combine them, they put it together, and they pick the one that maximizes the expected utility. They say, no, of course not. This is just, people behave as if they were doing that. So it's not really meant to be a real model of the psychological processes that lead to the choices. It's an as-if interpretation. That's the standard way of calling it. In the Milton Friedman sense, Milton Friedman was a very important economist from the 50s, where exactly he proposed this idea that the point of economics is not to describe the underlying psychology, but to predict the outcomes, the final outcomes based on the psychology, but not the psychology per se. So I spent this time trying to show you that this is how an idealistic model looks like, and I gave you some ideas about its features. Now I'm going to contrast it with something, and it's for the same task. It's again for choosing between these two gambles. But it looks different, and it is different. So what's the difference? Maybe you should take a couple of minutes to read what's in the boxes, but I will also read it to you. You ask yourself some questions about the attributes of the problem, about the outcomes, and about the probabilities. But you don't put them together in one formula. You don't put them together and try to optimize. Rather, as I was trying to say before, it's a pragmatic model where you try to satisfy. So here, in the first question you ask yourself, you try to make sure that you don't get a gamble that has, where the worst case scenario is very bad. So it's possible that you choose one of the gambles, but you will not choose the one that has a much smaller minimum gain. I think this is important, so I'll go back. So these are the two gambles. The minimum gain of this gamble is 4. There's only one gain, so this one gain is the minimum gain, and it is 4. Yeah? Here, there are two possible outcomes in this gamble. The 10 and the 0, so the minimum is 0. So according to the first box that you saw before, what cannot happen is that you choose this one. You're not going to go for the one that has the 0. You may go for the one that has the 4, the larger minimum gain, but you're not going to go for this one. So you're making sure you don't get something unsatisfactory. You may make a choice which will be satisfactory. It may not be the best choice, but it will be satisfactory in the sense that you choose the 4 which is larger than the 0. Let's go back. So this is what the first question you ask yourself does. It's an attempt to ignore some of the information. If indeed you made a decision there in the first step, you would do it by ignoring all the probabilities, for example. You would only do it based on the minimum gains. But then you would get something that's in some way satisfying. It's not the best, but it's somehow satisfying. And it's exactly the same story if you go down to the other regions. It repeats itself. I don't want to tire you with that. That's not exactly the point to go to the techniques of this model. The point is that this model is a pragmatic model because it ignores information, goes for a satisfactory outcome. And there are other things in this model that make it, in a way, the opposite to the other model. to the model to the left, to Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory. It's a model that attempts to show you what the process is. Process means something that unfolds over time. Process is when I say, first you'll do this, then you'll do this, then you'll do that, and then you'll make a decision as a function of all these things that you did. That's exactly what this says. It says, first you will do this. It's possible you make a decision. It's possible you ask another question, and so on and so forth. So it's an explication of the process. The psychologists who developed these models propose that's exactly how it happens. They didn't only model the outcome. They didn't say people behave as if they do that. They said people behave like that. It's very different. It's a very different way of thinking about how to model people's behavior, the idealistic way and the pragmatic way. In case you are wondering about the data on how well these models do, there is an answer, but seeing the rate by which we're going and the other stuff I want to cover, I think I won't get into that. I also suspect that maybe it will be too detailed for you, but if somebody is interested, you can ask me, and I can tell you how it works. This was meant to be a representation of the data we have from laboratory studies that show how well each one of these two models describes people's actual behavior. Instead, I'm going to keep with a conceptual theme and try to tell you a little bit about what I already told you, that's in this table, and then also about what I'm going to tell you as we continue. So, what I did tell you, I told you the first three rows of this table. I contrasted the two models, an example of an idealistic model and an example of a pragmatic model, and I gave you some features about how they're different. So the idealistic model, this model with the functions, starts from this idea of the omniscient and optimizing person, which is equivalent to logical axioms. For example, in this model, people do make transitive choices. It keeps the idea of optimization, and it doesn't exactly supposed to be a model of the process. Of course, it's a little bit vague. It depends who you ask. Sometimes the researchers say, yeah, but it's close to a process. It's something like a process, not exactly. So sometimes there's some confusion about whether it's a process or as if model. But I think it's fair to say, in the end, is not meant to be a literal model of the process. Maybe it gives some insight to the process, but it's not a model of the process. And on the other column, on the pragmatic column, you saw pretty much the opposite. So the inspiration here is something about how people do it. They ignore information, and they sometimes use only one piece of information to make a satisfactory choice. And, as I said, it's meant to be exactly a model of how people do it. It's literal. So, these are, in the next three rows, it's what I haven't told you yet, and I'm going to do it now, and I'm going to switch from the choice and the risk to a different kind of task and a different kind of evidence, equally important to behavioral economics, and in fact, more recent. So as I said, the first three rows have mostly to do with optimizing and satisfying, and now I'm going to tell you something about testing the models. And here, a key feature is this man, who's very interesting. He was a mathematician, turned economist, and then turned, in the kind of work I will present to you, a critic of behavioral economics. There is a very nice paper that he wrote for the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, where he critiques some of the practices in behavioral economics. And there is also a reply to that paper by Ernst Fehr and Klaus Schmidt, who are in Germany and Switzerland, and they reply why they don't believe it so. So, if you wanted to get a good spherical and quick idea of what some people think is wrong with behavioral economics and the response of these other people that they think there's not so much wrong, I could give you the references to these papers. They're very nice. They're a little bit dense though. They assume that you know already something about the field. So this is an example of a kind of thing that you would need to know to follow and to be interested. And it's another kind of task, like the choice under risk, but it's now probably a little bit richer, and it's different. Before we had one person, we had you trying to decide whether you want this gamble or this gamble, whether you want to take a risk or not. So it was in a way a game against nature. This is a game where one person plays against another person. So this is called the ultimatum game. In fact, this was, I don't know if it was exactly invented by Werner Gutt, who just retired from the Max Planck for Economics in Jena, or it was popularized by him. He's considered one of the initiators of this research. So what happens here? The black guy is the proposer, and the red guy is the responder. So there is some amount of money that magically appears in the laboratory. It could be 100 euros, let's say. The proposer guy, the black guy, goes first, and he has to decide how much to offer to the other guy, the red guy. So in this case here, he offers X. This X is something from 0. I think 0 is not possible. He offers something from 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 100. So he can choose to give you, you're the responder, 5 euros, 50 euros, 65 euros, and so on. And he has to decide how much to give you, knowing the rules of the game, and that's the interesting part. The interesting part is the arrow that goes from the red to the black guy. And it says the following, these are the rules. You, the responder, the red guy, can accept the offer. So if you know that there is magically this 100 euros, and I want to give you 40 of it, you can say, well, okay, 40 is okay, I'll take it. And if you do that, what the proposer says will be realized. So he will keep 60, and you will have 40. But you can also say, no, actually, I don't want this 40. You should have given me 50, or you should have given me more, or anyway, I don't like it. Yeah? So then you reject the offer, and if you reject, both of you get nothing. I get nothing, I made the offer of 40, and you get nothing, that you rejected my offer. We both get nothing. So this is the ultimatum game. The proposer gives an ultimatum, and the responder can decide if he takes the offer or not. If he takes it, it works as the proposer said, but if he doesn't, they both get 0. So, from your faces, I can see you're thinking about what you would do, and it's interesting, yeah? In a way, the proposer has all the power, in a way, right? Because he gets to go first, and he says what's going to happen. And of course, he could be very unfair. I'm using this word in somehow quote unquote unfair. But he can say, you know what? It's up to me. I will only give you 5. And you know, if you're that stupid to not take the 5, then you're going to take 0. So I think you're going to take the 5, and I'm going to give you the 5, and I'm going to keep 95 for myself. Of course, it's unfair in some sense, but I have the power. I'm the proposer. And I believe that you realize that I have the power, so I'm going to offer you very little, and you'll have to take it. And as you could imagine, based on standard game theoretic arguments, the neoclassical view of rationality is exactly that. The proposer should offer the least amount possible, and the responder should take it. And they both know that this is how it's going to work. So that's how it's going to happen. So if the minimum is 1, I will give you 1. And I'll keep 99 for me, and you have to say yes. And then I will live with 99, and you will have 1. Of course, as you can imagine, and as you probably already have decided, very often this doesn't happen. What happens very often? That the proposer offers 50, he offers half, and the responder is happy and he takes it. This is a more human, a more reasonable way of doing it. And sometimes there is something a little bit different, that implicitly the proposer says, yeah, maybe I should have given you 50, but come on, you know, I have all the power. And I still want to be nice, but I should make a little more than you. So I will offer you exactly 40 and I'll keep 60 for myself. So these are two common observed behaviors, the equality, or I have a little more than you from the proposer. But of course what also happens is that some people do act like economists. And they say, I'll take the most that I can take as the proposer, and you'll have to be happy with just having something, because something is better than nothing. Anyway, this is the data. And exactly because it contradicts the standard neoclassical rationality solution, many clever economists started working on it, started working on modeling how people do it. And it was again a case where we can see idealistic and pragmatic models. So as I said, Ernst Fehr and Klaus Schmidt did this. At the same time also, Axel Ockenfels, who's in Cologne, and Bolton did this, but somehow what Fehr and Schmidt did became more famous, so to say. But it's the same idea. And the idea is that you still have the utility function, but you put some social preferences in it, as they call it. Or you could call it norms. So, again, this is some math. I don't know how well you're interested in following or you want to do this, but it's important to some extent to see how it works. So, normally, in the neoclassical case, you would only have the X. Remember, X is the offer that the proposer makes to the responder. So, if you're talking about the utility function of the responder, normally we'd only have the X if he didn't have any social preferences. But here, it has something else. It has the responder's envy. That's an interpretation, you can call it something else. But let's call it envy. It's the responder's envy for the fact that the proposer is going to have more money than him. So here it's assumed that the whole pie, as they call it, this 100 euros that I was telling you before, the whole money that you have to divide, the two of you, is represented by 100%, it's just one. And think about it. If the responder gets X, the proposer is going to get 1 minus X. So the difference between what the proposer and the responder gets is exactly 1 minus X, right? And here you weigh by this parameter alpha that measures how envious the responder would be to the proposer. So let's think about it a little bit. If it were 0, it would mean there's no envy at all, right? So the money to you would only be what the offer of X will be worth to you will be exactly X. But if alpha is larger than 0, then you subtract something. So the X is actually worth less to you because you know that the other guy got more than you. He got 1 minus X while you got X. So, and the bigger the alpha is, the more envious you are. So it's a parameter for putting there some kind of social preferences and some kind of social norms. And they played the same, they played the same game with the proposer. In this case, it's not exactly envy, because the proposer is going to make more money than the responder. It's discomfort. And now the proposer has to come to terms with how much of a bad guy he wants to be. He's a nice guy if he gives exactly 50-50. As soon as he gives less than 50 to the other guy, so as soon as the 1 minus X is larger than X, he has introduced something unfair, and he has to live with it. So this is the discomfort. He's earning more than the responder, and he has to live with this discomfort. And that exactly shows you, incorporating this turns it into a different utility function in which social preferences are taken into account. Based on what I said before, you may already see that this is an idealistic model. Again, there are utility functions, and again, something is optimized, and so on. But there are other things going on too. So what I want to pick on in this case, and what Ken Binmore is complaining about in his article, which is in a way directed to the research by Fehr and Schmidt, is exactly that here there's a parameter, this alpha. Okay, fine, of course. You can understand why there would be a parameter, because not all of us are the same. You may be less envious than me and so on, so we need an alpha that we would estimate for each person differently. Binmore's complaint was that this is not really done. It's said that it will be done, but it's not. So in the end, you don't go and measure my alpha in one game, and then you take me to another game using the same alpha and to see how I behave. If you did that, you would be predicting my behavior in the new game. If you calibrated the model in another data set than the one in which you evaluate the model, you're predicting. But if you don't do that, you're fitting the data. And in general, in science, Binmore says, and actually everybody agrees, the goal is to predict, not to fit. Fitting is a little bit like making sense of the data that has happened in the past, while predicting is saying something about the future. So, you know, if you asked me, can you present a model that predicts the weather? I said, yeah, I can do that. And then you give me data from 1 year, and all that I did is I fit a polynomial to the temperature in each day of this year. Then I say, look, that's my theory of the weather. It is this polynomial. Would you be happy with that? You shouldn't, because I haven't done anything. I just made sense of the data you gave me for this past year. What I should do, I should split, for example, I should split the data in two. I should calibrate my model. I should fit my parameters in the first half of the year, and then use the same parameters to tell you how the weather is going to be in the second half of the year. You see the difference? It's a very big difference. It's different than rationalize. It's one thing to rationalize something after it has happened and say, yeah, we would have expected this has happened because it fits in this equation, and something else to say, I fixed the equation today, and tomorrow, what's going to happen will be according to this equation. So Binmore's critique is exactly that they let the alpha and the betas somehow be free, and then they change them in order to describe behaviors. To see how else it could be done in another culture, in the pragmatic culture, it's again a culture that doesn't think about utilities and optimizing, but just thinks about the reasonable, the simple-minded things people could do. So I kind of told you some of these things, and I think if you introspect about how you would do it, it would look a little bit like that. You think about possible rules of thumb of the proposer. So one rule of thumb of the proposer is that I will always give the half, or I will give the largest possible thing, because I would reason that you would have to take it. And for the responder, it would be that you accept everything, because you want to have some money. You prefer something to nothing. Or, this is a little more sophisticated rule, but still quite simple and reasonable. You say, let me think what I would offer, and I want to have at least as much, because I want the other guy to be like me. So, this is an alternative that, for example, is being developed right now in our institute to develop this kind of pragmatic model. But that's not the point. The point is, again, that this kind of model is different than this model. This model does not have parameters. It's actually all fixed already. And to a bit of a mistake here, I have to go back to you to tell you what I just told you. So I told you, by using this example with the ultimatum game, I told you about these different cultures and how they manifest themselves here, and mostly has to do with parameters. In the idealistic models, typically, they let the parameters vary freely. That means that sometimes they end up fitting data and explaining known facts. And it so happens, there's not necessarily a reason for that, but it so happens that they don't test models from any other culture, only from their own culture. And again, the other case, the pragmatic model, is pretty much the opposite. And there is not necessarily a reason why these three things should go together with these three things, or why these three things should go together with these three things, but they do. We haven't exactly figured that out. That's a task for historians. At least my claim here is that all these things tend to happen together. We don't know exactly why. Let me switch to the storytelling aspect. So we have more than 15 minutes to say that, and I think that's very important, and it's something that I think you'll find something here that you have heard a lot in the newspapers and magazines and so on. Well, again, the cultures are still the same, idealistic and pragmatic, and they have different stories. If you remember, when I presented to you the prospect theory, I said that one of the connotations was that people try to do something like the expected utility rational thing to do, but they don't do it exactly right, they do it a little bit wrong. So, in general, the claim is that in these idealistic models, because they start from what you should do, and of course people cannot exactly do it, the story is that people are irrational, they cannot actually get away from it, but they should. They don't maximize the expected utility, but they should. So, to my mind, this is actually a very frustrating message. So, if I'm the recipient of this message, and I take it seriously, I think I would feel bad about myself. I would be frustrated because somebody said, you should be up there, and you're here, but you should keep trying to be up there. So it's a frustrating message. On the other hand, as you may expect, in the pragmatic story, it's a little bit different. Of course, I didn't present you this kind of evidence to convince you of this claim that you see here, but we can discuss this. It's exactly, the idea is not that people are rational or irrational. It goes back to Simon's original idea that bound rationality is not a bad thing. What it says is that you have to be a little bit clever about which rule of thumb to use when. So, okay, let's think about the apartment again. As I said, you're not going to look at all the information in the pragmatic approach. You're going to look at some information for deciding which apartment to rent. Now, there are different rules that you can do that. Some of them are not very good. So, for example, one rule could be that, yes, if the person I'm going to be housemate with is blonde, yes, I'm going to go, because I think that's going to be fun. That's not a great rule. A better rule would be that you have one or two friends that know the people who are going to be your housemates, and you ask them, how is it to live there? Or how is it to live in that building? How is it to live in this neighborhood? And then because these friends know you well, and you know that they know your taste, you can trust them. And if you do it like that, you may end up with a good apartment. So the message being that some rules are good sometimes, and other rules are good at other times. The genius of taking this approach of using simple rules of thumb is exactly that you need to be able to pick the right rule for the right situation. I mean, to put it another way, let's say you go to a party, and you're trying to figure out who you're going to approach. Let's say you don't know many people. Who are you going to try to approach for starting a conversation and having a pleasant night? A rule of thumb that could work for you is that you somehow do it from the body language. You look at the person's posture and the way they carry themselves, and you realize if you're going to like them, exactly if, they're standing up tall or if they're handsome and so on, and you do it like this. And that would likely work at least sometimes. But if you apply the same rule in deciding who to hire for a job, that's not necessarily a very good idea. I mean, it depends on the job as well. But, I mean, you have to look at their CV, you have to look at their skills, you have to look at their competence. It doesn't necessarily matter so much, again, it depends on the job, but it doesn't matter so much whether they really carry themselves well so that you will have a pleasant conversation or not for this job. You have to apply the right tool in the right situation. This is, again, a very pragmatic way of doing things. And it tends to be, the claim is that the research in bound rationality that spawned prospect theory and inequity aversion models from Ferren, Smith, and so on, tends to align with this story that people are bad and they're a little bit hopeless. And this other research that looks at pragmatic models as the simple rules of thumb that I showed you tends to align itself with this kind of story. That yes, you could get it very wrong, but you could also get it right. The whole point is to have these meta skills to know what to do when. And we could, it's a little bit theoretical. What are the reasons why it would be the case that the idealistic culture would give this kind of story, and the pragmatic culture this other story? Maybe you can see it a little bit at an intuitive level, but there's also some theory behind it. We could discuss that later. But what I definitely want to present to you is this table, which exactly summarizes the differences in the stories. And this is, I think, where you would recognize some of the other buzzwords. Even though not as popular as Danny Kahneman's book, you may have heard of nudging. There was a book in 2008 by Cass Sunstein and by Richard Thaler that was called exactly Nudge. And it's an approach to making policy decisions, building up policy, that was in many ways enormously successful. So why? First, Cass Sunstein, one of the authors of the book, became President Obama's advisor for information and regulatory affairs. Second, David Cameron in the UK established what came to be known as the Nudge Unit, research on exactly how to nudge people. And recently, also in Germany, as far as I understand, the government in Berlin opened this new research department that's meant to investigate how we can nudge people into making big decisions. So, what is nudging? Nudging is when you gently push somebody towards doing something, and in this case, towards doing the right thing. So, some of the examples to give are the following. Most of us now accept the truth that we shouldn't be smoking, but nevertheless there are smokers. And the smokers are not always clueless people, but there are people that know that they shouldn't necessarily be smoking, and in a way they wish they were not smoking. But nevertheless they keep smoking. So you see the parallel. They're doing something irrational, to smoke, and they cannot really unlearn it. They keep smoking. So the thread of the argument goes, somebody has to push them towards not smoking. You know, you can do that with all sorts of ways. A way that often comes up, and it's the economy solution, is to make cigarettes very, very expensive. So people will start buying them less and less and so on. This is incentives. It's not exactly what's meant in nudge, because it's not exactly a gentle push. A gentle push would be if you start making it a little bit harder for people to smoke, which actually has happened. It used to be the case that everybody could smoke everywhere, but now smokers are in fact isolated. They have to get out in the cold and smoke there. They cannot start smoking inside the classroom. So this would count as a nudge, a gentle push towards eliminating an irrational behavior, because the person cannot eliminate the behavior by themselves. That's the idea. So you see the threat. By having this idealistic culture which says we have to be rational, you go to the story saying we have to be rational, but we can't. You could be frustrated because they told you cannot do it. So you have to get somebody else to do it for you. And here will be the authorities who will nudge you towards not smoking. So it somehow all fits together, the idealistic culture, starting from something very theoretical, like the models of prospect theory, in the end, ends up giving very concrete policy advice. And this is serious, it did happen. And from what I told you again from the reception that the nudge rhetoric has gotten, we are to a point now that there are basically suggestions for nudging consumers everywhere. In the pragmatic culture, as I said, the idea is that we're not so bad, but we may be good, we may be bad. We just have to learn which rule of thumb to use when. So, it's a little bit of a cliche and a trite word, a word that's used a lot, but I find that to be a little more empowering. Because they tell you that it's possible to develop the competencies that you need in order to make a rational decision. So, you know, in the case of smoking, the solution would be exactly to educate you, to give you more information, to give you the facts about what really happens when you smoke, even though overall, as I said, we kind of believe as a society that smoking is not very good. You may not realize how many years on the average it takes of your life. You may not realize how many years it will take off your life for your specific case, for the risk factors and for your general health. You may not know this exactly. Or you may not know exactly on the average how many operations and treatments you will have to go through if you are a smoker. And by the way, I definitely don't want to pick on smokers. This is just an example about how the different cultures would work. The point is, again, that the solution here wouldn't be to gently push somebody towards doing something, doing the rational thing, but they don't even know that it's happening. But you tell them explicitly, in a way, take your life a little more in your hands. So you have to develop some competencies on how to make the right decisions, and that's the education part of it. And as I said, it flows from the whole commitment of the pragmatic thing. So what I wanted to show is that even though in the first part of the lecture, of course, the things were very theoretical, and we're talking about models of behavioral data, in the end, naturally, this data and these models lead to some kind of story. And the story is very important because President Obama and Chancellor Merkel and Prime Minister Cameron, in the end, they have to rely on the story, and they do. And then, depending which kind of scientists manage to win their confidence, then you would get two different programs. You would get a nudging program and an educating program. And it could be that those of you here who are very interested in improving society have thought about it much more deeply. But I would say one thing, even though it's probably kind of obvious. I personally wouldn't be so happy to live in a world where they make me do stuff and I don't even realize it. That could be a little bit of the nudge world. And I would have to trust that they in fact know what would be best for me to do. I would have to trust them. While in the educating world, I think, that was the whole part of what the Western civilization is going through for the last 300 years. The point is that somehow you have some competency, and you can, and they give you all the information that we now have, and then you make your decision. So let me wrap up. There's two different cultures. As I said, somebody could come and say there are three or there are more. But there's an argument to be made that you can separate them into two. I think they relate to how you want to live your life. So I find that interesting that it starts by being very theoretical with these models of data, and it relates how the authorities decide that we live our lives and how we decide to live our lives. And as I said, from where I come from the academic part of it, this is very important because if there's a tension, that's not a bad thing. It's just an opportunity to do something, to resolve it. But if you don't know that there's a tension, then how can you hope to improve things? And for our discussion, I'm going to leave you with the two tables. I hope you can see them. So there's a table that summarizes the differences of the cultures in the technical aspects, and the table that summarizes the difference of the cultures in the storytelling aspects. So thank you very much.